Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to the third episode of the Darnell Weeks Show. And as I told you, we would be covering a famous unsolved true crime case. And I have with me a legend in the making, at least in my opinion. You've seen him on the History Channel, and the show itself was called History's Greatest Mysteries. And you've seen him on Peacock in the show The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Please welcome true crime author Mr. Drew Beeson. Mr. Beeson, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you, Darnell. I really appreciate your support over the years now, man. We've been friends now for a good few years at least.
Yeah,
And
and
you've
it's
always been an ardent supporter of everything I do. So I really appreciate, you being there for me all these years now.
oh, you're welcome. My first question would be for those who know you, and even for those who don't, you are recognized for your work in the true crime genre, primarily Zodiac. And so, with that in mind, my question is, did you ever consider pursuing a different career before becoming a true crime author? If so, what was it? And what led you ultimately to choose a career in true crime instead? What was your previous aspiration before true crime? What did you have in mind before that?
I never had anything specific in mind. Of course, I don't make a living at this. People are shocked to hear that, especially when I did a DB CooperCon, which is the annual DB Cooper Fest held in
Mm-hmm.
November. Last year it was in Seattle, and I was a keynote speaker talking about my suspect in that case, which is Ted B. Braden, Black Ops Special Forces guy from Vietnam. And that went really well. I was the first guy to go. And a lot of supporters flew from all across the country, wanted to meet me, get a book signed. And that was a great experience. I really appreciate the three guys that put that on and invited me to do it. It was really nice. And people would say, "Oh, when are you going to speak next?" Or they're always under this guise that I make a living at this, and I don't. If I try to make a living at this stuff, I would be like living under a bridge. So I'm in the commercial real estate business. I have been for like the past 35 years. I lease and manage shopping centers and do construction in shopping centers, retail centers. It's mainly, that's how I make a living, and that's still doing that. But if I had my druthers, my dad, that's a word my dad really loved. I always focus in on words, but I'd like to be a genetic genealogist. I think that is like one of the coolest things you can do. Of course, that's what led to the capture of Joe D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer.
Yeah.
They look at his DNA sample and then start doing genealogy traces on it. I would love to do that because I have as a just a personal hobby. I was really started as a genealogist, kind of how I led into doing what I'm doing now with this stuff. It was a heavy genealogy background, just kind of doing my own. I can trace my family name back to England in the 1400s, where a man took a woman's name, which is kind
Mm-hmm.
of interesting because back then, if the woman had the landed title, the man would assume the woman's name. That's kind of
Yeah.
where my name Beeson comes from because a woman actually started with that name in the 1400s in England. So really into genealogy. So and that's kind of been a nice tool to have in true crime, and especially if it's suspect driven to go back through their genealogies. And I've had some finds regarding Zodiac that are uh, using genealogy. So to say what I'd really like to do would be a genetic genealogist, but I think I missed the boat on that. I have the genealogy part, but not the genetic part. So
Well, how
there's some people that are
ironic,
really good at that.
how ironic would it be though if that very thing caught the Zodiac Like it would be really weird, like if somehow you could pursue that now in your life and you ended up catching the Zodiac. How would you feel about that?
That'd be cool. There's some people out there that have been doing it a while. I had lunch with one of them, Catherine Fitzpatrick, that solved the Somerton Man case. That's a pretty popular case that was very fascinating out of Australia. She's an American, and she's a genetic genealogist, knows all about DNA. we got to talk about Zodiac a lot, you know, in the status of the DNA in the Zodiac case, which is really uh, pretty much non-existent. There really is not DNA in the Zodiac case, contrary to popular belief. There's just not. They have a really weak sample from one letter that came from outside of a postage stamp using PCR testing by the San Francisco Police Department crime lab. And the time that they extracted that sample, they ranked dead last in solving violent crimes in their city out of all major cities, as per the San Francisco Chronicle. So there's really no faith in that sample whatsoever. It could have been from the mailman if it comes from the outside of the stamp. And PCR testing, people might know of that from the COVID years, where that would be the most accurate COVID-19 test to see if you had it over as, like, let's say a home test you bought at Walgreens or something. If you wanted to really know, because some of those tests could give you a lot of false positives and false negatives for that matter. But if you wanted an accurate test if you had COVID-19, would be to get a PCR test. And that's the same that they were trying to use to get that DNA sample from the 78 letter. And another thing to add to that is the 78 letter is not even considered Zodiac canon, meaning there is no consensus that the Zodiac even wrote the 1978 letter, which starts with the phrase, this is the Zodiac speaking his famous intro and says, "I am back with you." The last canon letter is considered the Exorcist letter written in 1974. So the best sample they have comes from a letter that's not even guaranteed to have been from the Zodiac himself. And this, of course, is the DNA tested against Arthur Lee Allen, still the prime suspect in the case to this day. He'll come into play a lot here. He always does. He always will. And there's a big reason why. It's hard to separate out Arthur Lee Allen from this case. You know, he's like, I've heard him, he's like, I've heard it referred to as like gum stuck to your shoe. You just can't get him off. He keeps coming up. But the state of the DNA and the physical evidence in this case is severely lacking. So I don't think the Zodiac Killer case will ever be solved with DNA, unfortunately, or genetic genealogy like they did in the Golden State Killer case, which Paul Holes was very instrumental in that. And even though Golden State Killer was obviously a serial killer, he was also a rapist. The Zodiac Killer was not. He did not sexually assault any victim that we know of, and therefore did not leave any tangible DNA behind. He touched a few items, and unfortunately back then, when these crimes started happening in late 1968, there was no one had ever heard of DNA, and all the items were handled by multiple people with bare hands, such as the letters that were mailed in claiming to be from the Zodiac Killer. There's some bindings used at the third canonical crime at Lake Berryessa in September of '69. And those bindings were handled by the Napa Police Department, who had jurisdiction there over that crime. And it's just contaminated. I mean, there's some partial fingerprints from two of the crime scenes in the Zodiac case, and none of those parcels match each other. There is one case file that someone had dug up fairly recently that says that one of the parcels did from Paul Stein's cab. It was the fourth canonical crime by the Zodiac. It was a cab driver named Paul Stein in Presidio district of San Francisco. It said that one of the parcels did match one of the letters, I think, written after Paul Stein was murdered, but they're very, very, they're not good samples. They're just not. I mean, they're partials. They've never come back to any known suspect, including Arthur Lee Allen. So I just don't think those fingerprints are going to lead us anywhere, or we'll ever find any DNA in this case. So if it gets solved, it will have to be by other means.
Okay, but with that being said, there have been many suspects and theories over the years, with the primary suspect, as you pointed out, being Arthur Lee Allen. But there have been others named like Richard Gaikowski and Ross Sullivan and Lawrence Kane, among others. But however, as I pointed out earlier, you seem to have your own theory. With that in mind, my question is, why do you believe your theory is more plausible than others? And would you like to discuss your theory further? Tell us.
That's an easy one for me, because with any case, and I do that, and that applies to DB Cooper as well. Want to do a lot, kind of has a lot of shared audience with Zodiac. Is if you have a suspect in a case, it's all about why that person is a suspect, or why does the person championing that suspect. Where did they come up with that suspect? It's all about where they came from. What was the genesis of that particular suspect? Well, we already knew the genesis of Arthur Lee Allen, and he comes, mainly comes from an accusation from his friend Donald Lee Cheney, who's my particular suspect. I believe he was the main driver and the orchestrator of the Zodiac crimes. And this is,
Mm-hmm.
Allen's good friend. He meets Arthur Lee Allen through Arthur Lee Allen's younger brother, Ron Allen, when Don Cheney's attending college with him at Cal Poly Pomona, which is just outside of Los Angeles, California. It's a technical college where Don Cheney's training to be a mechanical engineer. Ron Allen is there studying architectural landscape architecture. That's one thing they offered at that college. And then those two guys are roommates with another roommate named Sandy Panzarella, who comes up a lot in this case, and two other roommates that I don't think of. I don't even know if their names have ever been even bandied about on the internet. The other two roommates that live with these guys, but that's how Don Cheney winds up meeting Arthur Lee Allen, is through his younger brother Ron. So that's the genesis of where Arthur Lee Allen comes together as a suspect, because Don Cheney comes forward in July of 1971 claiming that Arthur Lee Allen told him on New Year's Day 1969 that he was going to become the Zodiac Killer. And he's very explicit about this. He said he was going to call himself Zodiac. He was given a Zodiac wristwatch, which is still, they're still made today. Those watches have been made for about, I think they're going on 90 years old, maybe older, but it's one
Mm-hmm.
of the very few times that the name Zodiac spelled out, and
Mm-hmm.
also what we call the cross circle logo, which is the circle with the X going through it. It goes outside of the lines of the circle, usually called the cross circle logo the Zodiac used. One of the only times the name Zodiac and that symbol come together is in that wristwatch. Well, Arthur Lee Allen was allegedly given one of these wristwatches by his mother for Christmas of 1969. And that's very important too, because the truth is he was given that watch for Christmas of 1968, not 1969. So,
Mm-hmm.
actually, he was given it to for Christmas
7.
68, and actually he got it in 67, according to his brother Ron, who got an identical Zodiac watch, which were popular with skin divers, which is what one thing that Arthur Lee Allen did. He was actually
Mm-hmm.
a champion platform diver. He was one state in college, and in high school he was literally kind of a pseudo celebrity in Vallejo for being a diver, and he was just that good at it. People have this image of him now and later in life as just this huge blubbering loser. But when he was in high school and his early days in college, he went to junior college, and then later he goes to a 4-year school at San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly, which is sister college to Cal Poly Pomona. He's still diving and still winning awards and trophies, and he's just that good at diving, at platform diving, and he's kind of a local hero in a way in Vallejo until he loses the ability to be such a good diver. But anyway, going back to your question, Allen becomes a suspect because of Don Cheney. Don
Mm-hmm.
Cheney enters this in 1971, very early on, because these crimes have occurred from December 1968 all the way through October of 69. And then there's a series of letters that are coming as well that go all the way through 74, maybe later, we don't know. But the difference is, in my theory, is that Don Cheney inserted himself into this case willingly in July of 1971. That's why we know who he is, because he comes forward saying, my friend told me he was going to call himself Zodiac,
Mm-hmm.
and he was going to kill couples on lovers' lanes, which Zodiac did on his first 3 crimes. And then he also claims that Arthur Lee Allen drove him to 2 of the crime scenes, one being Lake Herman Road and the other being Blue Rock Springs Park, which is in Vallejo, California, not far from where Arthur Lee Allen lives at 32 Fresno Street. So that's what makes Don Cheney different than any other, what I call cherry pick suspect, because every other suspect that comes along that somebody went and found, literally, like, oh, this guy looks like he could have been Zodiac. One name I'll throw out there is a suspect named Paul Doer, who I think is
Yeah.
actually a really good suspect.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from an author named Jared Kobeck. wrote 2 books about him, and he does pretty well. He's real popular on Reddit for a year, and then he kind of fades out because it just doesn't go anywhere. But for going out and finding your own suspect, I think he's one of the better ones. Ross Sullivan becomes a suspect literally because of a crime that's not even proven to be Zodiac, which was the murder of a college student named Sherry Jo Bates in 1966 in Riverside, California. And Zodiac somewhat tries to take claim for that crime in one of his letters, saying, "I've seen you stumbled upon my Riverside activity." So Ross Sullivan is based on a crime that's not even proven to be Zodiac canon. So it's all about where the suspect came from and who found him. Larry Kane was, you mentioned the name Larry Kane. He's a suspect that's been bandied around in this case for years now. He comes forward due to one retired police officer that was studying the murder and abduction of Donna Lass in Reno, Nevada. And that's not proven to be Zodiac for sure. It could have been, but they later find her skull. And that's like the last biggest news in the Zodiac case. I think that might have been now 2 years ago. That's how long we go without any news in this case. But they actually did find the skull of Donna Lass. And she's brought up in the Zodiac case a lot. But there's no proof that Zodiac ever murdered Donna Lass. And he certainly never abducted any of his victims in the canonical crimes, which are 4. So it's all about where the suspect comes from. Don Chaney literally lands into the case, inserting himself into it in July of 71. And in a case now that's well over half a century old, that's a blinking light of, hey, what's going on with this guy? No one went out and found Don Chaney. Don Chaney found the case. He said, I can solve it. I know who did it. My friend did it. And it all comes from there. That's why he's better than any other suspect, because he inserts himself into the case in 71, and his stories are not consistent. Everything he says is not consistent, such as his timeline of when Arthur Lee Allen told him he was going to become the Zodiac Killer and commit these crimes. Don Chaney originally says that happened on New Year's Day of 1968. Then famously, he moves that timeline to New Year's Day, 1969, a very critical error on his part. And he does it for a reason, because his original story was that he went by Arthur Lee Allen's house to cheer him up for getting fired from his job at Valley Springs as an elementary school teacher because he was groping the children, which is true. But what Don Chaney didn't plan on is that somebody finally went and looked up when Allen was actually fired from Valley Springs. And that wasn't until March of 69. So now he's got 68, sorry. So now he knows he's got to move that timeline from New Year's Day 68 up to New Year's Day 69. And he had many other inconsistencies that I have found when I really dug into the guy, because he lands on my radar after I watched a documentary called His Name Was Arthur Lee Allen. It came out in conjunction with the David Fincher film in 2007 called Zodiac. Great movie. Lots of, stars.
I've seen it. I've seen it. It was great.
Great movie. Great Fincher film. In box office was not a big success. Didn't really make a lot of money, but they based that movie off of a book by Robert Graysmith called Zodiac. And Robert Graysmith was around from the early years, from working at the San Francisco Chronicle as a political cartoonist. And he just happened to be there at the right time. He's working around Paul Avery, one of the few people that ever got direct correspondences from the Zodiac Killer, actually knows daughter very well. So Graysmith was just in the perfect spot to experience things that were going on with the Zodiac Killer back in the early days of being in the city of San Francisco when it was all happening. So he starts writing his seminal book on the case years later. And I think it took him like 5 or 6 years to even complete. He follows it up with another book called Zodiac Unmasked, but all the rest is history. But the movie was based upon his book Zodiac, which I think came out in 80. God, I want to say 1986. I might be off a couple of years, but
I think you're correct. So I guess I would ask you then, do you ever worry about repercussions from Mr. Chaney's family with you name dropping him as a suspect?
No. I've never talked to them, and they are aware of me. I can tell you that much. If I was them, I wouldn't be real happy with me either, because I kind of snuck into someone's Facebook to find some more information that I used that wasn't locked. I didn't do anything illegal, but I wouldn't like anyone really doing that to me, but I realize the internet, if you have an unlocked Facebook page, it can be perused, and there's really nothing you can do about that. And you cannot slander a dead man. He's deceased. If he was alive, I would never say his name if he was still alive.
Right.
He's been dead since 2009.
Hmm.
Of course, Arthur Lee Allen passes away in 1992.
And I don't want to.
Um,
I don't want to lead you. I'm just going to ask you. So you're saying that you think that they had some kind of connection?
who?
Lee Allen and Cheney.
Absolutely. This is a duo. I've always thought this was a duo. I know you always talk about how there's not this singular Zodiac, and that is true because Zodiac is really, I would refer to it as a cartoon character. It's like, Thomas Henry Horan. I know you don't like his theory, but and I think he kind of, he's a friend of mine, of course, but he, the words he chose to call his book with the myth of the Zodiac Killer, same as the
Hmm.
documentary. He's calling the Zodiac Killer a myth.
Yeah.
That's kind of true and not true. He's not. There was actual people died. People were
Yes.
killed under that name. There's no
Yes.
doubt about it. People were killed
Hmm.
under that name. There was an attacker at Lake Berryessa who was identifying himself as the Zodiac in costume, although he
Hmm.
never says I am the Zodiac Killer. He's wearing the cross circle logo over his costume. He's hiding his face. But at that moment, he's either acting the role or he's portraying the Zodiac Killer.
Hmm.
So somebody existed that attacked these people. One thing that is so crazy about this case is you can't say with 100% certainty that even in the four canonical crimes that it was the same attacker in any of the two crimes. There's a lot of similarities, but there's no physical evidence tying any of the two crimes. None whatsoever. So
And
you can
that's
see how
fine.
Warren can come up with a theory like that
Hmm.
because it's true. You cannot 100% say that the attacker at Lake Herman Road, which is the first canonical Zodiac crime in December, it was December 20th, 1968. Sometimes I want to say 18th because that's Arthur Allen's birthday. Also, Paul Stein's, which is interesting. They had shared a birthday, December 18th. But the first Zodiac known crime that's attributed to him is December 20th of 68. And then you go all the way to the Paul Stein cab driver being killed in the city of San Francisco on October 11th of 69. So these are all these, crimes are happening within 10 months of each other. There's no absolute proof that the same attacker was at even two of the crimes, much less
Okay.
all four. It was just what the police believed at the time.
My question to you is, do you believe that these are serial killings?
Oh,
Are they
absolutely.
connected?
Absolutely. I think at least three of the four canonical crimes I think were done as tandem brainchild between Arthur Lee Allen and Don Chaney all day
Okay.
long. We have two things going on. We have four different crimes where one attacker is present, and then we
Hmm.
have a series of letters and cards sent in by someone claiming to be Zodiac. Now we know for certain that the attacker and killer of Paul Stein in the Presidio neighborhood of San Francisco, Presidio Heights, actually,
Hmm.
it's called. It's the wealthier part of downtown San Francisco. We know that his killer either knew the Zodiac Killer or who was claiming to be, or was him himself, because after Paul Stein was murdered in his cab in October of 69, the attacker slash killer cut off a tailpiece of his shirt that was soaked in blood because he had been shot in the right
Hmm.
side of his head, right above his ear, with a
Hmm.
9 millimeter pistol. And of course, there was blood everywhere. And the attacker tore a good tailpiece section off of Paul Stein's shirt and kept it. He later sends in a letter with a piece of that bloodstained shirt that was matched to Paul Stein's shirt. So the letter mimicked anything the Zodiac had already written previously that was thought to be genuine Zodiac. The handwriting was very similar, if not exact, to a lot of the other letters. And obviously, he's got access to the shirt. So he was either the killer himself of Paul Stein, or he at least knew who the killer was to get access to his bloody shirt. So there wound up being two other pieces of shirt mail with two other correspondences. One, I think, went to the San Francisco Chronicle. Another went to attorney Melvin Belli, who lived in the city of San Francisco. In the movie Zodiac, they show a piece of the shirt coming out of what's called the Halloween card that was sent to Paul Avery. That's pure Hollywood. That never happened. I don't know why Fincher decided to do that. I guess it was for dramatic effect. That didn't actually happen. I think they just did that for I don't know, being Hollywood, because they show the scene where Paul Avery, being played by Robert Downey Jr., receives the card at his work at the San Francisco Chronicle, where he is a crime writer at that time. And he opens up the Halloween card and the piece of shirt falls out. So that didn't actually happen. That was all Hollywood.
Okay, Zoom is telling me I'm running out of time, so I got to hurry up with the next two questions. The third question being, now you have followed the Zodiac case for many years. You've even written a book on the subject titled Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer. And additionally, you have your own podcast dedicated to the case called the Zodcast. That's the name of your podcast. I think that's a very cool name, by the way. In 2023, your hard work finally paid off when you starred in two television specials. One was The Myth of the Zodiac Killer on Peacock, and the other one was History's Greatest Mysteries. How did that come to be? Like, how did you become involved with these television specials?
Well, I could tell you at least on the Zodiac, that of course follows the theory of Thomas Henry Horan. He's a friend of mine. You know, in the early days, I knew of the theory. There was a guy that I was working with that, you know, doing some podcasting and some voiceover work with, was a fan of his theory, and I had never heard of it before. I hadn't even seen the movie at this point, and he asked me, "Do you follow?" You know, I told him, you know, I was already into DB Cooper, and it did the DB Cooper Vortex podcast. My friend Darren Schaefer is the host of that very popular all DB Cooper podcast, and he brought up, "Hey, are you into the Zodiac Killer?" And I said, "You know, not really, but I'm interested in it. Tell me more." And he kind of started filling me in on some things I didn't know. You know, he really got my interest really high in it. He was an original believer in, like, that theory of Thomas Henry Horan, where he feels that the actual killer and the letter writer are not the same person, is basically what it's based on. He thinks a guy named Hal Snook, which was an investigator in the case for Napa Police Department, he was a detective for Napa, was actually the letter writer, who does have similar writing to the Zodiac. Was actually the letter writer in the case, and various other individuals were actually doing the attacks. Possibly the Hells Angels on one. He thinks it's possibly Dennis Land, who was a park ranger at Lake Berryessa, was the perpetrator of the Lake Berryessa attacks. That's kind of how, you know, what his theory is based on, and I thought that was pretty fascinating. And I remember early on, people would ask me to debunk that. You know, hey, can you debunk Horan's theory? Because, you know, he's kind of a guy that's like, hey, well, you know, he's just doesn't take a lot of crap off of people, kind of like me. And I kind of like that about him. And I never really saw a reason to try to debunk that theory, because I thought that this case had a place for a theory like that, especially because it was already a 50-year-old case at that point, almost over, and it's not solved. The physical evidence isn't there. You can't even, like I said earlier, you can't even 100% say that it was the same attacker at two of the crimes. So a theory like that's going to arise, and I think it has its place.
So
It's hard to tie into my theory,
how
but
did
I
you
always
get
thought it had
involved?
its place. So the long story short is, I never spoke ill of his theory, which leads to a friendship between us. And he brought me into that show to be somebody else that knew the case, that wouldn't really speak ill of his theory, but also have a different theory. So that's kind
Okay,
of, they kind of brought me in to be a contrast to that. And they
that
also
makes
brought
sense.
on Zodiac expert Michael Butterfield, who really kind of attacked the theory head on, where I
Yeah,
was more of a friendly supporter, but still have a different theory guy. You know,
yeah,
I know it's hard to
yeah.
explain, but that's why they brought me on. Of course, they had to interview me, and they were kind of interested in my theory as well and had a lot of film on that, but a lot of it hit the cutting room floor. But that was fine. I was really happy to be involved in it. They flew me out to go to the sites, and we actually filmed that in a house in Benicia, California, which is just outside of Vallejo, close to Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs Park, where two of the crimes occurred. So it was a great experience. It was really kind of full circle.
Well, I'm running out of time, but I guess I'll ask you very quickly. As I pointed out, most people know you because of your work with this case. And I know that you, along with others that are interested in this case, hope that it'll be solved one day. So, my final question to you is, if you could choose another famous unsolved case to be solved, which one would you want it to be? What other famous unsolved case do you want to see solved?
That's a great question. If you asked me that before they found Richard Allen for the Delphi case, I would have said the Delphi case. But I'm pretty darn sure that Richard Allen is the man that did those horrific murders of those two girls.
Yeah.
Would have absolutely gone with that because it was just so horrific. A child was involved. I'd probably say John Benet Ramsey.
Okay, that's very interesting. I like that. Well, Mr. Beeson, I wish I had more time with you. I want to thank you for being on the show. Guys, if you haven't checked out the book already, it's called Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer. And you can also see Mr. Beeson on the Peacock special, Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Mr. Beeson, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And maybe if something comes up, we can do a follow-up episode.
Sounds good, my friend. I appreciate all the support over the years.
So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Darnell.
If you have any questions about the show, or you would like to be booked as a guest on the show, you can email me at darnellweeksshow@gmail.com. Once again, that's darnellweeksshow@gmail.com. Thank you.